Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Changing the Climate, a show where we talk about the changing world around us and how we can make it better. Brought to you by Climate Change Realty. The only real estate brokerage that donates 50% of its net commissions to 501c3 nonprofit organizations dedicated to fighting climate change.
Scott, nice to meet you, man. Thanks so much for taking some time to come on the show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ethan.
My pleasure. We always like to get the podcast started with a little bit of background on who you are and how you got to be doing what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah. So born and raised in Michigan, and a big influence was I grew up with a father who was an academic, so a professor at Michigan State, and not only an academic, but he had his own laboratory. So as a kid, I used to go in there and I used to just play around with things, and I got to be exposed to a lot of scientific things that really led me down the road of pursuing science just based on opportunity. And then I also taught sailing in the summers. And so I loved marine biology and I loved being on the water. So when I thought about whether to go down finance or all these different roads, I said, I really like being by the water and I really like science. So I studied marine biology. And, without, really thinking about what am I going to do and how am I going to make money someday? But I just kind of pursued my interests. And I said, if I like this, we'll make something work if you really like it. So studied marine biology, worked at a bunch of companies after college doing algae biofuels, all sorts of different biotechnology products. Got my PhD in molecular biology, studied algae while I was doing that, and then started the business that we can talk about today while I was in grad school.
Really, really cool. Well, what's crazy to me is that we've got this giant planet with billions of people, and we know a fair amount. Science has evolved a lot over millennia, but the marine world, it's like a whole nother planet. I've talked about this on the show in the past. Have you always just been interested in the ocean and life underwater?
Yeah, it's interesting. I scuba dived. I grew up in Michigan where there's lakes everywhere. And, I think you're right. I mean, part of my interest was, I remember I taught sailing and I was a lifeguard in California during one summer. And I sat there and I just looked at the ocean and there's kelp everywhere. There's dolphins. And it just said, it is an unexplored world. There's untapped potential in microbial life or marine life because it's a whole nother world, right? So I always kind of came from this angle of there's got to be discoveries, there's got to be interesting things we can do with these resources. Because when you think about it, the world is mostly ocean, and
For
so
sure.
there's a lot of things that have been unexplored, and so that's kind of why I want to get into it. Is let's figure out what's down there, and and it's always been on my mind to not only figure out what's down there, but how can we apply it to make the world a safer, more sustainable place that can help humans.
Right on. So was your thesis related to the company that eventually ended up coming out of your PhD or what?
Yeah, not really. It was actually, so I studied some pretty in-depth molecular biology things. All of it was about kind of trying to grow algae as a crop. So there was some application there. So when you think of corn and potatoes, I mean, those crops have been grown for tens of thousands of years, right? Like trying to breed plants to make a better corn plant. And so algae was kind of this new crop that needed some help to kind of get off the ground and grow consistently and grow it at scale. So my PhD was there. It was not related to ink or pigments, and nor did I know anything about that. The idea actually happened when I was in grad school, and I was very deep in the zone of science and algae. I was in the lab. I went out to there used to be an old Safeway store on the corner next to my building in grad school. It was a Safeway, and I went to buy a greeting card, and I just looked around me and I just realized ink was covering everything, and I just had this moment of what is ink? And I was in grad school where I was very creative. There's no kids, there's very few distractions. I was just thinking about the world, and what's everything made out of, right? And then you go back and you go, okay, ink is made of petroleum. And then you go, well, what's my toothbrush made out of? And you're like, oh, well, it's plastic, so it's petroleum. And then you start going down this list and what is everything that I use? And it's all petroleum. And that's when I became obsessed with let's replace some of these petroleum-based products with kind of more sustainable or bio-based products. So it happened in a Safeway grocery store, not studying or even, in my lab, but it all contributed.
Well, it always seems to be like that. People have these epiphanies and things. I had no idea how integrate. I didn't even know what petroleum was, a year and a half ago. The opportunity of talking to all these amazing people and getting deep into the space, you start to learn more and more about how the world works. And I remember I had one person on the podcast who's more of a climate skeptic, and she's like, "What are we going to do if we get rid of all the petroleum? It's like your headphones are petroleum, your microphone's made out of petroleum. It's like everything is." So, what exactly is Living Inc? Like your company? What do you do?
Yeah. So at Living Inc, what we do is we work with algae producers, so essentially algae farmers that are around the world, and we take part of the algae that they grow, so kind of a byproduct of the algae. And
what is algae?
Good question. So algae is the little plant that grows in your ponds, your swimming pool, the ocean. It's usually green. It can be red and brown. It can be these different colors. But yeah, it's an aquatic plant that floats around, and you may have even heard of some of the algae blooms that occur when there's a bunch of nutrients like down by Florida, and these algae blooms come up, and just demonstrates the potential of it, right? There's these algae blooms because they grow so fast. So it's a very productive organism. And what's great about it is that it actually uses sunlight to grow. It's essentially solar energy. And so we take algae and we turn it into pigments, and these pigments can be used in everything from ink on your shirt to ink on your shoes to cosmetic products for eyeliner. We can even put it into plastics like here and actually make a plastic or rubber colorant. So right now we're focused on making black pigment and black ink, but we can also do different colors. So yellow, cyan, red, and actually make different colors for all these different applications.
Did you not have like an interest in going down like the academic route and becoming like a researcher, or was that ever in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of was, because that was my background, and I really respect basic science, and I think that there's a lot of scientists or academics around the world doing really great science, even if it's not truly applied. We have to understand the basic science in order to know anything about how to apply the science. So there was a part of me when I started grad school that, I thought, I could go down that academic route. And then after working at these startup companies, I just get very excited. And it's almost like a little bit of adrenaline rush to say, how do we make these leaps of faith? How do we make things happen? And, the goal that I've always really wanted to do is, I watched a lot of my colleagues in grad school struggle to get grant funding. So you get a grant and then you spend all that funding and then you got to go get more grants. And so my whole idea really since I was in college was develop a company that has strong revenue, that is a financially sustainable business that can then allocate funds to do R&D and to do other cool, crazy science. And so, more of a sustainable enterprise, less of a go get grants and spend the money. And so answer yes, but definitely not. I'm going down a very hardcore startup path right now.
Right on. And how long ago did you start the company?
Technically, it was 2014 while we were in grad school, so we weren't doing it full time. We just had a few ideas. We did a crowdfunding campaign, and we won some business pitch competitions, and kind of like you not knowing what petroleum was a year and a half ago, we sat down with an advisor from CSU, and her name was Sharice Bowen, and she was at the entrepreneurship department. And she said, we got to get your deck together. And we're like, what's a deck? And she's like, oh, it's, it's a couple slides that talk about what you're doing. So, that's how, the only way you ever start approaching a subject is by starting from scratch. Right. And so that was kind of 2014. And then ever since then, we've been learning every single day, every week about business, science, all these things.
What was your experience like going from like getting like the hardcore data and science to like this whole trailblazer, I'm going to start my own company kind of phase?
Yeah. I think it's really fun. I think what's different about, there's a lot of similarities, problem solving, independent work, curiosity, and even in business, even with what you're doing, you have to make a hypothesis that I think this business is going to work. Now I got to figure out how to make it work. And I might prove that this doesn't work, but I'll go over here and I'll try this. So I see a lot of similarities, but one of the biggest differences, and the thing that I really enjoy, is kind of the relationships and the people, right? In science, there was nobody that could ever help me finish my PhD. It was, I had to do the work and the science had to work and I had to publish the paper to then graduate. What's fun about business, even from day one, is that, one conversation can change the way you see things, can change the partnerships that you have. And I think that's the exciting things, is that things move very fast, and where science things typically move very slow. And that's part of the challenge with Living Ink, is that when, someone says, some brand will say, can you do this? And we'll say, technically, yes. Okay, well, how long would that take? What are the resources needed to do that? But we've worked on a couple projects where people have actually paid us to do some of the work up front. So, it's just a different model of doing things. But yeah, every single good thing that's happened at Living Ink is because of people, whether it's internal, external, it's just people.
Well, I love that. I mean, the whole society, the whole world is built on people. It's something you got to forget, or you can't forget. And then people can be unreasonable and people can be reasonable. That's why I always love the value of discourse and just kind of talking through everything, which seems like it can be tough sometimes. But let's get into a little bit of a conversation about like what is ink. I'm sure you have like the figures, like. You said you looked around and it was like covering everything, but how much ink do we really use, at least in the US, each year? And like, what's like the primary usage for ink? I imagine as soon as you said that, I'm like looking at my tie and I'm like, this tie, it's like this my grandfather's tie. It's like, this is probably ink as well, right?
Yeah, it's definitely got pigments in it and definitely dyes, if not kind of ink. But so I mean, worldwide, about 9 billion pounds of ink is used every year. So it's I should probably have a number to put that into relative terms, but it's a lot.
It's a whole lot of elephants.
It's exactly. A whole lot of elephants, exactly. So, it's used from everything from packaging to textiles to publications. I mean, even on my desk here, I've got ink everywhere. I've got, things on my wall that are covered in ink. And it's amazing at how many groups reach out to us. So whether they're looking for pigments or ink, but adhesive companies, HVAC companies, liquor companies who are doing promotional materials or labels. I mean, it just goes on and on. Like when you start talking to brands, how much ink they use in all these different things. And I would say that a few years ago, ink was kind of a secondary thing, right? Plastic was a big deal. Cardboard was a big deal. And now everyone's realizing, wow, like this ink can really affect things both from a safety, from a sustainability aspect. It's one of those things that you never think about. I never did until you start to look around the world going, oh, there's ink everywhere. Every Amazon box is just covered in black ink now,
Yeah. So we do use a lot of ink, but I did want to ask you if you think it's actually something that's like necessary for our society.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a great question because as someone who is, focused on sustainability and really, in some ways, just minimalism, right? Like, I'm all about using less ink, right? When I go into the store and I see like a box covered in yellow ink, I'm like, is that really necessary? And I think if you ask the marketers, like it is, like they have to stand out. They have to have their brand, like Coca-Cola Red, like it has to be Coca-Cola Red. It can't be off a shade. And so, I think that there are people out there that, will say that, that ink and colorants is a big part of the, success of the brand that they've built. That being said, you're starting to see a lot of brands, especially the larger ones, that already have built that great brand to say, you know what, we're going to do craft paper that's 100% recyclable, and we're going to throw some black algae ink on there, and we're going to keep it simple, and we're going to use minimal ink, and that's what I like to hear, because I work on some of these projects, and I'm like, ideally you don't use any ink if you don't have to. Mm-hmm. That being said, when you think about a label, a label has to have ingredients on there. It's got to have barcodes. So, there are a lot of applications where ink is completely necessary. But a lot of, in the digital world, we'll realize, we don't need to print newspapers as much, maybe, because we can just pull it up on our phone and things like that.
Yeah. Well, I love asking the ink salesman if he thinks ink is necessary. Just like people are like, should I buy a house? It's like, I don't know. Yeah, I'm going to try to take an unbiased. It's what's in your best interest. But no, I think if you are a good salesman, you do genuinely care about your customer, and if you have this integrated sustainability piece, it's definitely a factor in your mind. So let's talk about the difference between like industry standard ink, specifically like when it comes to carbon footprint, or versus your ink product in particular.
Yeah. So in terms of kind of sustainability.
Sure. Yeah.
So, one of the, I'll say performance and sustainability. So really what we're focused on right now is making a black pigment that replaces a pigment called carbon black. Carbon black is made from, they basically burn a bunch of oil and they get a little bit of this leftover kind of soot or just kind of black pigment. And so that's, a tire is black because it has carbon black in there. So again, my headphones have carbon black pigment. So water bottles, the plastic and rubber carbon black. So a lot of carbon black out there. We go head to head with carbon black in terms of performance and sustainability. And there's a couple performance issues or issues to talk about that we've overcome. And one is that the black pigment that we made doesn't fade when you leave it in sunlight. So UV light from sunlight, the reason that we put sunscreen on is because UV light's pretty harsh. UV light can start to break down materials and colorants. And so we have a black pigment that's made from algae that doesn't break down under UV light. And then we've also developed a pigment that's really black, because when you talk to a marketer or a brand manager, like if they're going to do black, like they want it to be jet black. They don't want a brownish black. They want it to be black. And so our two main characteristics, black doesn't fade in UV light. From a sustainability standpoint, there's about, if you make, let's just say you fill up my water jug with a pigment. Mm-hmm. We'll call it a liter. To make that liter of carbon black, you produce anywhere between about 2 to 5 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So if you make this much carbon black, you would produce 2 to 5 of these full of carbon dioxide that go into the atmosphere.
Man, wild.
What we do is if we make a kilo or a liter of algae black that fills this container up, we actually remove about 4 of these of carbon dioxide. So that's how we become, not only are we neutral, but we're actually removing carbon from the atmosphere because of the process that we've been developing, which is difficult. Like even the professor that we worked on the life cycle analysis with was going like, oh, this is really interesting. Like this is how you do it. And I can get into the details without going too deep, but that's kind of the sustainability is that, we're about 200% reduction in carbon emissions compared to the traditional carbon black.
All right. First off, that's awesome. Second off, I'd love to go into the details if you don't want to go too PhD molecular biology deep, but whatever you want to share, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. I mean, so basically, we've developed different colors of ink, right? And so we've developed, let's just say a green ink from algae, right? So if I printed green ink on my paper here and we go put it in my backyard, it's going to start to break down and it's fully biodegradable. What biodegradable means is that these bonds are breaking, and as that's all happening, this would be covered in green ink. You'd come out a week later, and there'd be no more green ink in there because it's fully biodegraded. Now, as it degrades, it's releasing gases. So, in some ways, people say, "Oh, biodegradable is really good," but biodegradable does mean we're releasing gases back into the atmosphere. Now, what we do at Living Ink is the process that we've developed. We're actually locking up. I'll start from the beginning. So algae grow, like, if you've ever seen a green pond, that's just algae growing. As it grows and as it kind of grows more and more cells or more and more biomass, it's actually growing. Its building blocks are carbon dioxide. So as it grows, it's pulling carbon dioxide out of the air, similar to a tree, just using carbon dioxide to grow. And what we do in the process with making our black pigment is we lock that carbon up into a form that's stable for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So what's interesting is that the black pigment that we produce is not truly biodegradable, although it's safe and it's inert, it just sits there. It's actually storing the carbon that was pulled out of the atmosphere from the algae. So that's kind of how that carbon negative works. So I don't know if that was too deep or not deep enough, but
no, that was perfect.
Man. Yeah, it's basically a carbon capture technology that just keeps these chunks of carbon stable.
And how does like the price compare to like the typical petroleum-based ink product? And if there is a premium, who's willing to like pay it?
Yeah. So right now, one of the goals we're doing is getting down to price parity. Right now we're working with a lot of early adopters who are willing to pay a premium, but there is a marketing value. There is a story. We are a small company. So, it depends on the ink type. Some ink types we're right at price comparison. So for some of the screen printing inks here in the US. Now, when we start going overseas to Asia, we're about twice as expensive as these traditional inks that are used. But some of the largest brands in the world, both for packaging, textile, footwear, are starting to adopt this ink. And what's interesting is that when you print on a shirt, you're only using so much ink. So even if our ink is a little bit more expensive, it's still a very small or insignificant part to the overall cost of goods sold of making, let's say, a shirt, for example, or a pair of shoes. So I've been pretty surprised at all of the different brands who are now starting to just not even worry about price point and say, we got a great story here. And we know that we need to do things that are more sustainable because that's what the consumer is demanding.
Right. So is your company mostly like B2C or do you have or B2B or do you have like customers that actually buy the product for you just to use around the house or something like that?
Yeah, we've done a little bit of both over the years. Right now I would say we're pretty focused on B2B.
Sure.
We have to sell a lot of ink to small kind of artists and groups doing things versus one large order to, let's say, a Patagonia. That's right now what really helps our business is some of these larger orders where there's a lot of volume being printed. What's interesting about being, an ink salesman, I guess, and being in the ink industry is that, to print, 10,000, here's my sheet of paper, to print 10,000 of these sheets of paper, you don't need that much ink. And so that's one of the challenges is that we have to be pretty large scale and we have to be at volume in order to really kind of move the business. I think sometimes people say, oh, we did a 10,000, print order with your ink. And it's like, yeah, it's relatively small amount of revenue to do that. Now, when you start printing 10 million shirts, like there's some good revenue there.
Definitely.
From the ink side of things.
No, for sure. So what are your plans? So we're talking about 8 years into the game. What are your plans for like scaling the business long term? And how many people do you have on your team at the moment?
Yeah, we're 8 right now.
Cool.
Yeah. We just hired a COO who we've been working with over the years, and he's amazing. So yeah, really excited about that. And scaling. Last year was a big year. I mean, last year was really the first year that we sent out bulk pallets of ink to really printers all over the world and almost every continent. So that was a big year for us. And we're seeing a lot of these brands who have been doing smaller trials or mid-sized trials now starting to scale up and use this at scale. So right now we're right where we kind of want to be in terms of the scale up. We're looking at different models and how to scale this, whether we partner with an ink company, like a larger ink company, or some kind of partner that already has millions of dollars worth of capital equipment in house, where we can kind of work with them to scale it, rather than kind of build out our own little ink factory. We can make about 1,200 pounds of ink per day in our current facility in Colorado. Mm-hmm. So we do have the capacity to fulfill on decent size orders, but one of the big things, again, we'll come back to people and companies and partnerships, I think, to really scale this globally.
Yeah, as always, man, always comes back to people. Can you tell me a bit about your Timelapse Inc. product? Because I think that's very interesting.
Yeah. So that was that's what kind of we founded the company on.
Awesome.
And, I remember calling up my now co-founder friend at the time, Steve Albers. We went to grad school together, and we were always coming up with ideas, because kind of like you, we said, like, we know we're going to be successful. What are we going to do, and how are we going to do this? What ideas are we going to come up with? And, I called him up and I pitched him this idea, like so I can send you, let's just say, a greeting card in the mail. And on day 1, it says happy birthday. On day 2, a cake shows up. And day 3, candles pop up and it says from Scott, happy birthday. So you can it's a living ink. So I call it it's kind of like micro gardening. So how you garden and you plant plants. This is basically doing the same thing, except you're doing algae like in a small.
It's photosynthesizing.
It's growing. It's literally growing. So you could put it underneath a lamp. You could put it by your window with sunlight. And so that was our time lapse card. And, we had a lot of cool potential and stories there. Like we were thinking about doing billboards with like ad companies where if you did the same commute every day, like every day it changes and you're like, wait, what the heck?
Awesome.
Like that wasn't there yesterday. But this kind of came back to business model. What's the bigger picture here? And I think there's some cool stories. I think it was very creative and maybe innovative and artistic. But we were starting to send out product that contained like plastic and other materials. And to your question, like, do you even really need ink? I was saying, do people really need this? Is it cool? Yes. If it helps kids think about things, that's awesome. But really my whole goal is like, hey, let's scale up a material that really does have a major impact on sustainability that we can really implement into the supply chain for that impact.
Why do you care, man? Like, where did the interest in sustainability even come from? Is it that connection with like the life in the ocean, or what was it that got you to have these strong values?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it's just like the respect for, I guess, earth and nature. And then also just like, I don't think anyone, if you go to the beach and you see trash everywhere and you see, marine life not doing well, like I don't think that makes anyone feel really good, and so I think that's a tough question to answer. But I was raised by um, a family that really, like, if you went to the beach and you saw trash, you just picked it up. Like that's what you did because you're like a good citizen, right? And whether it's about climate change or like the safety of marine animals or just like, hey, we want the beach to be clean so we can play, like there was always just that mentality. I also just think that, I just think that these are reasonable things to be doing, right? And what started my motivation early on was that when you think about oil or petroleum, like when I learned that it's a finite resource and it took 600 million years to produce that oil that we're using at really fast pace, whether it's climate change or whatever, like at some point there's going to be alternatives. And for us humans, we think of 100 years as a really long time, right? But in terms of the earth, like it's not even a microsecond, So when we say, oh, we got enough oil to last us another 100 years, well, we better be innovating right now. And we better start, and kind of like what your climate skeptic talked about, like, petroleum is used everywhere. If you said no more petroleum today, that would really be a bad deal for all of us who need to, drive around and use materials. That being said, alternatives and need to be developed now, and we need to start transitioning all of these petroleum-based products into alternatives. That's my take. So it's really about just keeping the world going.
Hey man, it's a good take. I mean, the world's such a good time. Might as well keep it going. We can always improve, and I love that. So you had a big name drop there of Patagonia. Are there any other large companies or industries that are specifically interested in your product at the moment?
Yeah, we've got some of the largest footwear companies and outdoor apparel companies using it, from everything from fleeces to shirts to shorts to shoes. So 2022 should be a big year in terms of launches with these brands that then we can kind of talk about all the work that we've been doing. We just did a launch with a European apparel company that's a very innovative company called Volbach. You can look it up online, and they tell a great story about what black pigment is right now and how algae black is a better pigment in all these different ways. So yeah, just starting to do some launches after years of R&D and learning how to scale this up. Patagonia's been a really great partner of ours, really starting in 2018 all the way up into they're still buying ink for various packaging applications and things like that.
I mean, yeah, that's one of the best examples of a company that operates like really strictly on values, which is something that I really hope to represent at my business as it continue to grow as well. Last thing on algae, I did want to ask you, there's more opportunities for drawing down carbon beyond just your ink product with algae. I'm sure as you've studied algae for many years, I wanted to know your thoughts on like comparing it to other carbon drawdown opportunities like reforestation, planting trees. Could we grow like a lot of seaweed to sequester carbon?
Yeah.
You put any thought into this?
Yeah, I mean, like, there's, so we use kind of a small type of algae called microalgae that you can grow domestically. Like, like right now, one of our major algae suppliers is in Southern California. And so they recycle all the water that they use, and they harvest the crop every single day. And there's other groups doing kind of kelp or macroalgae, and they're actually going out into the coastal areas and harvesting that and learning how to grow it better. And, we kind of don't realize this, but the ocean is a huge sink for carbon because there's so much algae out there. And so harvesting that algae, I think there's a lot of potential there. There's companies making algae materials into footwear, into foams for shoes and surfboards. I mean, there's a lot of innovation going on out there. So I think there's a huge opportunity for algae in the near future. And then, in how it relates to other drawdowns, I think algae is favorable for some reasons, but I also think, planting trees and maintaining forests, I don't think you can beat that in terms of we know how to do it. We should do it. However we can do that. In terms of the numbers, one number that we came up with is that if you turned all of the black ink in the world into algae ink, it would be about equivalent to 17 million trees. So
cool.
There's definitely like an impact there, even with something that's as trivial as ink.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's less trivial than I might have imagined before this podcast when you really start to look at the world and think about how it works and how there's so many different integrated pieces going on. And that's what I love talking to people like you who have like their specific area of expertise, whether it was in ink or in algae, and then you integrated them both together. But there was that sustainability value behind what you were doing, and it's so cool to talk to all these people from different sectors doing this stuff. It's amazing. There was an
Yeah.
something interesting I read about you and your background. I wanted to ask you, and I've kind of gotten this just from the podcast, how you kind of
Yeah.
look around the world and are just genuinely curious individual and
Yeah.
want to see how things work and how you can improve it. So I just wanted to ask you how you
Yeah.
think that shaped your life so far.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And, I think that, I think curiosity leads to a lot of great things. I've loved raising my kids so far because I get to read these books that break things down at a very basic level, right? Like jets, like how does a jet engine work? Like I couldn't tell you that like a year ago. Now that I'm reading this book with my son, I'm like, oh, I know how a jet engine works, right? So I'm always very curious about how things work, how things are made. The first time we ever went into a printer and we saw packaging being produced for a brand, I said, this is crazy, right? This is where the cardboard's made. This is how the printer works. Like, I just get very fascinated with that. And I think it shaped my life in the way that I've never really cared about maybe the superficial things in life. Like for example, like in college, like I should have been studying for an exam. But then you end up in this Wikipedia rabbit hole of like, how are antibiotics made, right? And in my head, I'm going like, this is not like what I should be doing right now. But in terms of my values and curiosity, it was a great use of my time. It got my brain
Sure.
going in ways that I never thought it would. And I go, oh my gosh, what if we could do this? And then I'm going back to my book going, oh, I need to be able to at least get certain grades so I can, go into grad school and do these different things. So I think that's always been one of my top priorities. And, really, one of the things we did at Living Ink to take the pressure off, this was like early days with my co-founder, Steve, is we said, let's not talk about exit strategy or multinational partnerships. Let's focus the number one priority on being learning every day. If we learn something every day, good things are going to happen, whether it's about business or science or anything like that. And so that's really been our motto. And, even after we have a day where there was some challenges, we said, did we learn something? Yeah, we absolutely, even during supply chain last year, like we were learning every day, like how things work, how we kind of come up with solutions. And it's going to make us so much stronger, right now and into the future. So really looking at these challenges as opportunities and then being curious about how things work. Because if you understand how things work, then you can kind of be able to manipulate it and control it the way that you want to do it, whether that's science or business.
Yeah. I mean, last year was definitely a big year for understanding how supply
Yeah.
chains work. That's
Yeah,
for
I think
sure.
we're still learning. Even the experts are learning how it all works.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of what Ray Dalio says. It's like dreams plus reality equals a successful life.
Yeah,
So yeah, understanding
yeah,
how
yeah,
things work, but always being curious and trying to create innovation is pretty cool. So I
yeah,
love what your
yeah,
company's doing, man. It was really a true honor to just have you on the show for a little bit to chat.
yeah.
I always love to ask people at the end here, what advice do you have for maybe someone who has trouble focusing because their head is so full of all these other ideas? I
Yeah,
might have a
yeah.
little bit of similarity to that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I've come up with is like trying to block off time where you get to just dream big, think about where you want to be in 10 years, write anything crazy down that's on your mind. And then there's that time that's just got to get things done and focus, and right now at Living Inc, we're in this growth period where it's about manufacturing, being consistent, things that, I think are probably on the more boring side than generating brand new ideas and trying to like to get that into a product. One of the things that I do every day that I think is very useful for me is I write down like my 3 priorities for the day every day. And if I'm not going after those priorities, and I'm doing something wrong. And so, even if I go down the Wikipedia, rabbit hole now, I have to say, no, I have to get these things done and I have to go back to those priorities. And if you do, if I do that every week or every day, every week, every month, like good things will happen if I'm tackling those priorities. But I have to write it down just to remind myself, like, stay focused today.
Yeah. What I found to be very useful is to have like specific times blocked off to just like a thinking session, or I have
Yeah.
these gigantic whiteboards in my room
Yeah.
and I'll
Yeah.
just like
Yeah.
write all my ideas down. I mean, like probably every quarter I'll just have a day where I just write
Yeah.
like what's my vision, what's my mission, like
Yeah.
how am I reaching my goals now, and
Yeah.
yeah, cool.
It's great.
Scott, thanks for taking the time, man. It's been a true
Yeah.
pleasure.
Thanks for doing what you do. I think it's innovative, and I think it's, leading the way in this thing that people really haven't thought about or done really. So thanks for doing what you're doing, and thanks for letting me join you on the podcast today.
My pleasure, man. Yeah, we need to integrate sales, and we need to sell a better life, sell a better world. And I think that's exactly what you guys are doing as well. So you're very welcome,
Yeah.
man.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for listening. See you soon.
So if you or anyone else you know is looking to buy or sell a home anywhere in the USA and would like to create thousands of dollars in donations without any cost out of pocket, please visit ccrboulder.com today.